The first real cold of the season came down on Calgary, like a held breath finally let go, and by 4 o'clock the light over the downtown core had gone the color of dishwater, all the glass towers throwing back a flat winter shine. Up on the 40th floor of the Marchmont Hotel, behind doors of brushed brass, and a wall of windows that looked west toward the white teeth of the Rockies, the restaurant called Cerisier was warming itself for the dinner service. The room smelled of clarified butter and cedar polish, and the faint green of fresh-cut herbs. Out in the corridor, where the public could come up just to stand at the glass and look at the mountains, the heat from the kitchen never quite reached, and the marble floor stayed cold enough that people kept their coats on. Through the service corridor, the one that smelled of laundry steam, and the back of the elevators, came a man who did not look like the kind of person the Marchmont had been built to flatter. Wade Lachance, 38, had a furnace technician's hands, wide across the knuckle, and permanently marked at the creases with the kind of gray that no amount of scrubbing fully lifts. He stood a little under 6 feet, and he carried himself the way men do when they have spent 20 years bending into crawl spaces and mechanical rooms, a slight forward set to the shoulders, a readiness to duck. His parka was good but old, the cuffs gone shiny, and he had a folded work order sticking out of the chest pocket, because he had just signed off on a job 2 floors down, in the hotel's old boiler room, where he had spent the afternoon coaxing a tired heat exchange unit through another winter. His boots had been wiped at the door, though the salt line had already crept back up the leather. Beside him walked his daughter. Posy Lachance was 7 years old that very day, and she had spent most of the morning reminding everyone of it. She kept pace with him in quick, deliberate steps, her chin up, watching everything. She wore a red knit toque pulled down over her ears, and the toque mattered, because her mother had made it. Colette had cast it on the winter she got sick, and finished it in the chair by the window with her hands shaking, and Posy wore it now in every weather, indoors and out, the way some children carry a blanket. Her snow boots were a size too big so they would last the season, and they made a soft thunk against the marble. She held her father's hand and she did not let go. He had brought her up here because of a promise. For weeks she had been asking about the hotel where her dad sometimes worked, the one with the restaurant in the sky, and he had told her that on her birthday, if the job downstairs went clean, and the check came through, they would ride the glass elevator all the way up, and she could have a hot chocolate at the fancy place, and look at the mountains from higher than the mountains. He had not told her how much a hot chocolate cost at a place like Cerisier. He had checked quietly, the way he checked everything, and decided he could swing it this once, for her. Some things you do not let a kid see you do the math on. They came out of the service corridor into the public hall, just as a voice cut across it. "I'm not going to ask you a third time. You need to leave." The voice belonged to a woman in a fitted black suit standing near the host stand at the entrance to the dining room, and it had that particular brightness people use when they want everyone nearby to hear how reasonable they are being. A small knot of onlookers had gathered, the way they do, half of them already lift their phones, most of them not lifting them to help. In the middle of the knot stood an old woman. Winifred Fontaine was 79, though grief and a bad hip had added a decade to the way she stood. She had on a wool coat the color of wet slate, well made once and now gone soft at the elbows, and a paisley scarf knotted under her chin. Her white hair had been pinned up that morning with care. You could see the care in it. And the care made the whole thing worse somehow, because she had got dressed to come to a nice place, and someone had decided she was not the right kind of person to be in it. A canvas tote hung off one arm, the handle frayed where her thumb had rubbed it for years. She was not shouting. She was not arguing. She had the still, folded look of a person who has realized, mid-sentence, that the people in front of her have stopped hearing her as a person, and started seeing her as a problem to be removed. The woman in the black suit was Renata Pelham, 34, the floor manager of Cerisier, and she had been told a great many times by a great many people that she had impeccable judgment about who belonged where. She had spent the last few minutes deciding that this old woman belonged on the ground floor, or the street, or anywhere that was not the entrance to her dining room. 20 minutes before the first reservation, Winifred had tried to explain that she only wanted a table by the window, that she had come to sit where she used to sit, that she had money, real money, in the small wallet in her tote. Renata had not let her finish. She had told her, in the kind voice, that is the cruelest voice of all, that Cerezier was fully committed for the evening, and that perhaps the woman would be more comfortable somewhere down the block. When Winifred had said quietly that she was not a vagrant, that she had every right to be there, Renata had looked her up and down once slowly, taking in the worn coat, and the frayed tote, and the sensible shoes, and had asked, with a small lift of one eyebrow, "Then why do you look the way you do?" The question hung there. It was not a question, it was a sentence being passed. Behind Renata, half a step back and very uncomfortable about it, stood Dale Mercer, 29, the floor's security host, a big soft-faced young man who had learned a long time ago that the fastest way to lose a job in this city was to argue with the person who signed your timesheet. He had a hand hovering near Winifred's elbow, not gripping, not yet, just hovering, and you could see in his face that he hated where it was. Wade and Posey had stopped at the edge of the marble. Posey pressed in against her father's leg, both arms going around it, and the lightness she'd carried 40 floor drained right out of her. She watched the old woman's hands. They were trembling. She watched the canvas tote slip an inch down the thin arm, and the old woman grab for it, like it was the only thing keeping her upright. "Daddy," Posey said in the smallest voice she had used all day. "Why are they being mean to her?" Wade didn't answer right away. He was watching the way the old woman's chin kept tipping up a degree at a time. Not out of defiance exactly, but the way a person lifts their face to keep tears from spilling over the edge. He had seen that exact tilt before. He had seen it on his own wife, in the last hard year, in waiting rooms, when people talked over her head about her like she'd already left. "She looks cold," Posey whispered. "She looks like she did something wrong and she didn't." That was the thing about kids, Wade thought. They got to the bottom of it faster than anybody. Renata's voice came again, lower now, and somehow that made it more final. "Dale, walk her to the elevator." Dale's hand closed on the old woman's elbow. It wasn't rough. It didn't have to be. Winifred took an unsteady half step and the tote came off her arm entirely and hit the marble with a flat slap, and the seam at the bottom, old and overworked, simply gave up. Things went across the floor: a folded handkerchief, a blister pack of pills, a small leather wallet, and a flat paper sleeve that fanned open to show 3 photographs, old ones, square with the rounded corners they used to have, faces in them you couldn't make out from where the crowd stood. Winifred tried to bend for them. Dale's grip kept her up. A man in a long camel coat, waiting for his table, stepped neatly around the handkerchief without looking down, annoyed by the inconvenience of it being there. A young server inside the doorway, Joelle Renaud, 19 and 3 weeks into the job, brought her hand up over her mouth and looked sick. A pair of teenagers near the back were filming and grinning. Most people just watched. Posey had started to cry. Not loud. 2 tears, quick, gone before she could decide to stop them, sliding down into the wool of her toque. Wade ran the arithmetic in his head, the way he always did before he did anything that might cost him. He had no lawyer. He had $410 in the account until the next contract cleared. If this went sideways, if Dale or somebody decided to make it physical, he could end the evening of his daughter's 7th birthday in the back of a cruiser, and there was nobody else to take her home. He had every reason in the world to pick her up, walk to a different floor, and buy her a hot chocolate somewhere the trouble wasn't. Then Posey looked up at him, both cheeks wet, and asked the only question that closed off every escape. "Daddy, aren't we supposed to help old people?" She wasn't watching him to learn how to keep them both safe. She was watching him to learn what kind of man her father was, and that, more than the old woman, more than the cruelty, more than anything, was what got him moving. He crouched down to Posey's level. He told her yes, they were. He took the small white box that held her birthday cupcake. the one he'd carried up so the icing wouldn't smudge, and he pressed it into her hand so she'd have something to hold. He pointed at a marble pillar a few feet off and told her to stand right there, where he could see her the whole time, and not to move. Then he stood up, and he crossed the marble, the way he walked into a mechanical room he didn't know yet. Weight low, hands loose, nothing wasted. He came up between Dale and the old woman and turned so that his body slid into the gap, and he looked at the young security host and said 3 words, even and quiet. "Let her go." Dale's head came back an inch. He scanned Wade from the shiny cuffs of the parka to the salt line on the boots, and something in his face tried to find contempt and couldn't quite. He asked who Wade was. "Family?" "No," Wade said. Renata's heels came clicking over sharp little sounds. She said this was a private matter, that the gentleman should mind his evening. "It became my business," Wade said, not raising his voice at all. The second he put his hand on a woman who could be either of our grandmothers. The sentence had the kind of quiet that travels farther than a shout. 2 more phones came up around the edge of the crowd, and this time, the people holding them weren't smiling. Renata stepped close enough that he could smell her perfume over the kitchen. She told him, with a patience that was meant to make him feel stupid, that he did not understand how a restaurant of this caliber operated, that there were standards, that there were guests paying a great deal of money for an experience, that women in this woman's condition sometimes came up to luxury floors to panhandle, or to use the washrooms, or to get warm, and that it was her job to protect the room. Wade let her finish. He had learned a long time ago that people who talked like that talked themselves into a corner if you just let them. "Did she ask anybody for money?" he asked. Renata's mouth opened, closed. "Did she steal anything? Threaten anyone?" "Nothing." He bent down, slow, and gathered the things off the cold marble, the handkerchief, the pills, the wallet, the paper sleeve, with the 3 old photographs, and he held them out to Winifred with both hands the way you hand somebody something that matters. Her fingers when they took them were shaking so badly that he kept his palm under hers a moment longer to steady it. He asked her, low, just for her, whether she was hurt. She said no. Though her wrist where Dale had held it was already coming up pink. He straightened and looked back at Renata. "Then what you're throwing her out for," he said, "isn't a crime, it's the way she's dressed. You're punishing her for being old and not rich, in front of a kid, and you're calling it standards." A murmur went through the watchers, low but real, the sound of a crowd starting to pick a side. Renata's face changed. She had been embarrassed. Now she was angry, which is a more dangerous thing in a person who is used to winning. Her eyes went past Wade to the pillar where Posey stood, with the little cupcake box clutched against her chest, the red toque, the 2 big boots. Renata looked at the boots a beat too long and let a thin smile cross her face. "Maybe," she said, loud enough to carry 20 feet. "The 2 of you would be more comfortable at the food court." Posey's whole face crumpled inward. She looked down at her own boots, the ones her dad had bought a size big so they'd last, and a hot flush came up that had nothing to do with the heat from the kitchen. Wade felt the pulse jump once in his neck. He made a decision, a conscious one, not to let it jump twice, because the most important person in that whole 40-story building was a 7-year-old at a pillar, and whatever he showed now, she would carry home and keep. He turned just enough that Posey could see his face and find it steady. Then he looked back at Renata. "My daughter's boots," he said, "have walked through more honest places than this restaurant will ever serve." Somebody near the back laughed, a short surprised bark, smothered fast. A man in a navy overcoat lowered the phone he'd been holding and just stared. "Take them out, Dale," Renata snapped. All 3. Dale didn't move. The hesitation lasted maybe a second and a half, but it was long enough for Renata to see it, and what she saw made her angrier than the old woman ever had, because the whole machine she stood on top of depended on people like Dale doing the thing without the pause, and the pause was the first crack in it. By now the noise had pulled others off the floor and out of the kitchen. Not to help. To manage. Lorraine Pike, 51, the hotel's director of guest relations, arrived first, a clipboard pressed to her chest, her reading glasses up in her sprayed hair. Behind her came Bram Ostrander, 40, who ran private events and VIP service for the whole Marchmont, and wore a lapel pin shaped like a tiny key. Neither of them asked Winifred what had happened. Neither asked Wade. Neither so much as glanced at the child, at the pillar. Bram took in the scene and lowered his voice to the register men use when they think they're being adult about something. He said the public corridor really ought to be better controlled. That they'd had 3 of these this month. That it wasn't the look the hotel was going for. Lorraine fretted that several arriving guests had already noticed, and that one of them was a travel writer. And then she said the thing that mattered, the thing she meant only for the little circle of staff, dropping her voice the way people do right before they say the part they don't want recorded. "Just get it sorted," she said. "Before Ms. Fontaine comes up. She's in the building tonight. She does not need to see this." Winifred, standing close enough to hear the name, gave no sign at all. She kept her eyes down. But her chin came up one more careful degree, and that was the only thing that moved. Wade caught it, filed it. Didn't know yet what it meant. Bram turned on him. He told Wade he was embarrassing himself, that he should collect his daughter and go, that in 5 minutes nobody in this room would remember his face. Wade looked at him for a moment. "What kind of grown man," he asked, evenly, "helps run an old woman out of a room because she might make a richer person uncomfortable, and then calls it doing his job?" Bram's mouth opened and shut on nothing. Lorraine tried the gentle route. She told Wade he simply didn't understand the pressures of a property at this level, that there were 100 things he couldn't see. Wade let her get all the way to the end of it. Then he said, "Quiet. The thing that kills a place like this isn't an old lady in a wool coat. It's the day the staff start deciding which people are allowed to be treated like people." That landed. Lorraine's eyes flicked to the crowd and saw, maybe for the first time, how many phones were up. It was Winifred who broke the standoff. She lifted her face the first time she'd looked up from the floor, and she spoke directly to Wade in a thin, even voice. "Take your little girl and go, dear," she said. "It's her birthday. Don't let this be the thing she remembers. I'll be all right." Wade looked at her. Then he looked over at Posey, who hadn't moved an inch from the pillar, who was watching him with that cupcake box held against her heart, like it was something fragile. "If I walk away from this," he said low enough that it carried mostly to the old woman, "I'll think about it every single time my kid asks me what kind of man I am. And I'll have to look at her and lie." Something in the room shifted before anyone could name it. The watchers nearest the dining room doors began to move aside, not because anyone had told them to, but because the air had changed, the way it changes before weather. A woman stepped out of the private elevator at the far end of the corridor. Adele Fontaine was 30 years old, and she had been the president of Fontaine Hospitality for exactly 4 months. She wore a charcoal sweater, and plain trousers, and flat shoes, nothing that announced itself, and she walked the way a person walks, who has spent the last 16 weeks reading every complaint file her company had buried. Half a step behind her came Hollis Tremblay, the group's chief counsel, a small precise man with a steel-gray beard and a tablet under his arm. They had been upstairs in a glass office reviewing the quarter, when a notification had pinged on Hollis's screen, a flag from the security desk, and Adele had stood up without a word and gone to the elevator. Renata saw her first. The color went out of Renata's face the way the color goes out of a sky before hail, fast from the top down. Adele did not look at Renata. She did not look at Bram or Lorraine. She crossed the marble in a straight line to the old woman in the slate-gray coat, and her own composed face came undone in a way that made the whole crowd go still. And she said one word, and the word was not a manager's word. "Gran." The corridor stopped breathing. Adele took the old woman's trembling hands in both of hers, and bent to look into her face, checking her the way you check someone you love after a fall. She asked if she was hurt. Winifred said no, in the same small voice she'd used the whole time, and patted her granddaughter's hand as if Adele were the one who needed comforting. When Adele finally straightened and turned around, her face had gone very calm, and the calm was worse than shouting. "Tell me what happened here," she said. "All of it." Nobody wanted to be the one to start, so Hollis simply turned his tablet around and tapped it, and the security feed from the corridor began to play on the screen, and he held it up, and he let it run. The whole thing was on it. The crowd, the grip on the elbow, the tote hitting the floor and the scene letting go and the photographs spilling and the man in the camel coat stepping over the handkerchief. Renata's mouth moving. Then why do you look the way you do? The teenagers grinning behind their phones, and one ordinary man in a worn parka crossing the marble while everyone else stood still, kneeling to gather an old woman's things off the cold stone and put them back in her shaking hands. The teenagers who had filmed put their phones away. The man in the camel coat had already turned and was walking quickly toward the elevators. Joelle, the young server, had her hand over her mouth again, but this time not in horror. In something closer to grief. Adele let the clip play all the way to the end. Then she looked at Renata. Where, she asked very quietly, was the threat? Renata's voice came out thin and high. She said she'd been protecting the room. She said she'd following standards. She said the guest experience. Adele shook her head once. No, she said, you weren't protecting standards. You decided cruelty was the same thing as taste, and you dressed it up in the word experience, so you wouldn't have to look at it. Renata's eyes had filled. She said, and her voice was trembling now with the particular fear of a person doing the math too late, that she'd had no idea who the woman was. She said it twice, as though saying it again would change what it meant. And Adele answered her in a voice so level, the crowd had to lean in to catch it. That, she said, is the entire problem. You needed her to turn out to be someone before you'd believe she deserved to be treated like a human being. My grandmother helped my grandfather build this company from a single 12-seat room on 8th Avenue. Her name is on the deed to the floor you're standing on. But that's not why what you did is unforgivable. What you did would be exactly as unforgivable if she were nobody at all, if she were a stranger with $11 and nowhere warm to sit. She turned to Dale, the young security host, who looked like he wanted the marble to open up under him. She told him to report to the security office and wait there, that there would be a review of the use of physical contact on an elderly guest, and that he should think hard while he waited. About the second and a half he'd hesitated, because that hesitation was the only thing in the whole clip he'd be able to live with. Then she turned back to Renata, and she did not take her to a back office. She stood there, in front of the host stand, in front of the crowd, in front of the dining room Renata had run. And she relieved her of her position, effective that moment, for abuse of authority, for discrimination against a guest, and for bringing the Fontaine name into disrepute. She instructed Hollis to begin a formal review of Lorraine Pike and Bram Ostrander, who had both watched the whole thing and chosen to manage it, rather than stop it. And she said the review would not be quick and it would not be gentle. She told Bram that a man who could ask whether a corridor needed better control, while looking at an old woman on the floor, had told her everything she needed to know about his judgment. Renata, who 15 minutes earlier had ordered a woman walk to the elevator for the crime of being poorly dressed, listened to her own dismissal in front of the same crowd that had watched her do it. She did not weep in the end. She did not argue. She walked out toward the service corridor, and the click of her heels on the marble was, for a moment, the loudest sound in the building. When the corridor had cleared a little, Adele came back to where Wade still stood, with Winifred's tote held under one arm, because the scene was gone, and the old woman couldn't carry it. Adele stopped a careful few feet from him, and let a moment pass before she spoke. A hotel with 200 staff and 100 cameras and 4 layers of management, she said, couldn't protect one elderly woman's dignity for 10 minutes. And one man with no reason to get involved walked across a public floor and did it without being asked daughter's birthday, with everything to lose. Wade didn't flush, and he didn't preen. He gave a small shrug one shoulder, the way a man does when he's trying to push praise back where it came from. I didn't know who she was, he said. I just knew she was somebody's, and that they were hurting her. There wasn't any music to the line. He said it the way he'd have read a furnace gauge. Posey came away from the pillar then, 3 quick thunks of the 2 big boots, and threw both arms around her father's leg. the cupcake box mashed flat between them. Wade crouched and stroked the back of her toque and told her she'd been brave, that she'd done good, that it was okay. Winifred lowered herself down, slow, one hand on Adele's arm, until she was close to the girl's height. She took Posey's small hand in both of her thin ones, and held it like something that might break. "You've got a very good dad," she said. Posey nodded, serious as a judge, and then, in the matter-of-fact way of a child reporting a true thing, she told the old woman that her dad always helped people, that he'd stopped on the Deerfoot once in a snowstorm to push a stranger's stalled car out of the live lane, that he'd carried a neighbor's groceries up 4 flights for a whole winter after her hip went, every Thursday, and never said anything about it, that he gave the man outside the co-op his gloves once, and drove home with his hands jammed in his pockets, pretending he wasn't cold. Wade kept his eyes on the floor while she talked. He hadn't known she'd been keeping count. Adele asked him, quietly, what he did for a living. He told her he ran heating and ventilation systems for commercial buildings, mostly on contract, mostly nights and weekends, because that was when nobody was using the rooms. He said it plainly, the way you'd say the weather. Hollis, beside her, had been thumbing at his tablet, and now he leaned in and murmured something, and Adele looked down at the screen, and her brow drew together. She looked back up at Wade. 2 winters ago, she said slowly. Your name is on a contractor's report, the old North Wing. You flagged a cracked heat exchanger and a venting fault, and wrote that there was a carbon monoxide risk to the rooms above the boiler if it wasn't replaced before the cold set in. Wade said nothing. He remembered the report. He remembered writing it twice. It was closed without action, Adele read. The note from the property manager at the time says the flag came from, she paused, an outside contractor, not staff engineering. It was set aside. She looked up. 6 weeks later there was a detector alarm on the 4th floor of the North Wing. 2 rooms were evacuated in the middle of the night. The official write-up calls it a near miss. Wade absorbed it without surprise, the way you absorb a bill you'd already braced for. He didn't ask for credit. After a moment, all he said was that he hoped the guests in those 2 rooms had been all right. Adele looked at him for a long second. She didn't promise him anything there, in front of the crowd. She said, only, before she stepped back, that the Marchmont had spent a great many years teaching its people how to bow gracefully to the guests with money, and almost no time at all teaching them how to stand up for the ones without it. Then she crouched, and she asked Posey, very seriously, whether it was true that it was her birthday. A week later, a call came to Wade's cell from an office at Fontaine Hospitality, asking whether he could come to the Marchmont that Friday for a meeting with Adele Fontaine. He brought Posey, because there was no one to mind her after school, and because he found he didn't want to leave her behind for this anyway. The building felt different to him this time, and it took him a minute to understand why. A young woman at the flower kiosk in the lobby smiled at Posey, and gave her a single white carnation. The concierge said good afternoon and meant it. A bellman he'd never met nodded at him on the way to the elevators, and the nod wasn't the nod people give a tradesman they want out of the way. Adele met them in a glass-walled room above the main floor, with a window that looked straight down on the corridor, where the whole thing had happened. She told him plainly what she was offering. The position hadn't existed before that week. It would be called Director of Guest Care, and it would not be run from a desk. The work was on the floors. He'd walk the corridors, ride the service elevators, sit in the staff break rooms, and watch, in person, the way every kind of guest got treated, with particular attention to the elderly, to working people, to parents with small kids, to anyone who'd ever been quietly waved toward the door for not looking the part. Wade said he didn't have a hospitality background. He said he didn't have a degree. Adele said the company already had more degrees than it had decency, and that the one thing she could not hire a search firm to find was a person who'd do the right thing when nobody powerful was watching. She'd watched 14 seconds of security footage prove he was that person. He asked her, finally, why she trusted him with it. She didn't look away. Because you crossed that floor, she said. When you thought the only people watching were a crowd that didn't care and a 7-year-old who'd remember. He took the job. Not for the title, he told her, and not for the money. Though the money would change things for him, and Posey in ways he didn't say out loud. He took it because he wanted his daughter to grow up in a world where being kind didn't make a person smaller. And he figured the only way to get that world was for somebody to start building it where they happened to be standing. The afternoon ended down in the corridor by the windows. Winifred was there, on a bench near the planters, a new canvas tote at her feet, the same plain kind she'd always carried, mended at the seam by a tailor Adele had insisted on, and Winifred had grumbled about. She hadn't switched to anything finer. The staff who passed her now stopped to say her name. Joelle, the young server, brought her tea without being asked and stayed to talk. Posey ran ahead of her father and climbed up onto the bench beside the old woman and presented her, with great ceremony, with a folded paper crane she'd made at school, the corners not quite even. Winifred took it in both hands and held it to her cheek for a second, and her eyes did the thing eyes do. And the hot chocolate finally happened, the way it had been promised on a cold birthday a week before. They had it right there at the table by the west window, the four of them, with the mountains going gold and then violet behind the glass, the whipped cream towering up ridiculous and perfect, exactly the way a 7-year-old would want it. Posey looked up at her father with a mustache of cream on her lip. "Daddy," she said, and her voice was small but it carried. "Did you know she was somebody important?" Wade looked at the old woman on the bench, at the mended tote at her feet, at the paper crane sitting on the white tablecloth between the cups. He looked at his daughter, waiting for him with the patience of a kid who already, in her own way, knew what the answer was going to be. "No," he said. "That's the whole reason it counted."